Hello everyone. So I've decided to make this video, and I have to say from the start that it's not really a video I've really wanted to do. It's not something I really find pleasure in. It's not a subject that I particularly like talking about. But it is one that I think has grown in importance, especially of late. And that's the question of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX. And I've known about them for decades, of course, like a lot of us have, but it is sort of coming to a head. I've sort of been able to ignore them for the most part for most of my life, although when I went to college there was an SSPX chapel right down the road, and I never once stepped foot in it on purpose. For a background to my history with the traditional Latin Mass, which I do attend at my local parish here. I'm blessed to have it at my local parish in the diocese here. But I never wanted to go to the SSPX, and there's important reasons for that. And I'm going to give you kind of a background to this specific video. Many of you probably already know that Taylor Marshall recently has started doing a number of videos talking about the history of the society and the person of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and asking whether or not they're really all that bad. And then it sort of culminated with his proclamation publicly that on Easter Sunday, him and his family went to the society, and that he apologized for any erroneous things he said about them or critical things he said about them in the past. And it was that last part. Obviously apologizing for erroneous statements is one thing, but to recant any criticisms from the past is what a lot of people found to be the most problematic thing in his video, or not in his video, in his statement. And it created a firestorm. Obviously, Dave Gordon and Tim Gordon replied to that as well. Tim, was closely associated with Taylor for a long time and was really hard on him, strained the relationship. And then Dave Gordon sort of put out I was basically informed that this was taking place on Twitter, which I had not really been on. So I kind of hopped on there and started a new Twitter account to see what was going on. And then I saw Dave Gordon, Tim's brother. That must stink being known as Tim's brother. I mean, he's his own person, by the way. But anyway, I saw that he put out a call. He's like, look, it's time for us traditional members within the Catholic Church to start calling out the society and people supporting them, because it's not right and it is creating this division. And if we're going to be criticizing the church, which all of us, a lot of the traditional people, both in society and outside, within the Catholic Church, criticize a lot of things going on within the church, that we should also point to the problems within the traditionalist ranks and say, look, we need to call the traditionalists to a high standard as well. So that's sort of the background. And so I stood with Dave and I was like, I'm with you. I always had been. I mean, as far as the society was concerned, I never wanted anything to do with it. And then so last night I ended up getting this long debate with Steve Skojac, who I didn't even realize was associated with 1 Peter 5, because I never really read 1 Peter 5, and that ended up becoming a bone of contention accidentally on there. And but anyway, got into a long debate with him, and then some other people jumping in, so it was all over the place. And I find Twitter really hard to follow. I'm sitting here like refreshing and going back and trying to figure out who's replying to what strand and how it's all connected, and it gets really confusing after a while. And other person who's a supporter of the society jumped in, was chastising both of us, saying that we had no right as laymen to be teaching publicly on anything. And so asking whether or not we should even have lay Catholic blogs that are not under direct ecclesiastical authority. And, I thought that was a little ironic coming from someone in the society who's concerned about getting ecclesiastical permission to do things, since we'll get to that later. I thought it was ironic. But so as a rebuttal, I mentioned, well, I do have ecclesiastical degrees that give me a license by the church to teach theology, even on the master's and seminary levels. And finishing a doctorate of a doctorate of sacred theology and systematic theology. So I pointed to my credentials, just to say that, hey, look, I'm not just a layman in some sense. I have been granted ecclesiastical degrees. But I actually took his point well. I was like, well, maybe he does have something here. It's something to consider, how much of this blogosphere should be left unchecked. It's a valid question. It's worth pursuing. And it's something that I'm open to praying about as well. So anyway, that's kind of the background. And I thought Steve Skojac's perhaps best statement came at the end, where he said he was going to make this one last statement, then he was going to back off and just withdraw because it obviously wasn't going to be resolved. And I guess we all could have known that from the beginning. It's just, it is important to hash things out sometimes. But, and unfortunately, he then later got back on and started saying he muted me and was dogging me, saying that my university must have just been hurting for money, and that's why they, allowed me to attend. And this is what he was implying, saying that my college that I went to must have just been hurting for money because my thoughts were bad, my tweets were bad, my thinking was worse or something. I just thought that was pretty low. I mean, I've studied for decades. I've been studying theology academically. I've published in things. And then he starts like, oh, he's just bragging about his credential or about his studies. I'm like, I wasn't bragging. I was bringing them up in the context of defending both him and our ability to discuss faith publicly, and that we didn't, that we had credentials to be able to do that. At least I was doing my own. I don't know his credentials, but so he was saying it was basically being braggadocious, and then starts insulting me. And then Tim Gordon, actually, to his credit, he actually came to my defense a little bit and admitted that my corrections he actually appreciated, because I'd called him out on something, and he later saw that I was right about some things, that in that he was wrong about some things, and he appreciated it. And I thought that was a pretty stand-up thing to do. So I give Tim Gordon a lot of credit for that. And I'm not going to draw out those things. That's another thing. But I think he's a very sincere and genuine person. And he also said that he thinks Steve is genuine. And I don't know Steve. So that's fine. I don't appreciate the things he implied and insulted me after he said he was bowing out of the discussion. But I did think that his final comments were worthwhile to contemplate, but it's stuff I'd already thought about. And what I mean by that, he made, and I'm just going to summarize here, he said that what makes him and others who, like himself, are not even associated with the society so upset at other Catholics who are criticizing the society is that the society, in his words, are obviously dedicated to teaching the Catholic faith and the Orthodox Catholic faith, and celebrating the traditional Latin Mass, which is a good thing. And basically then started to go on a rant about how awful things have been in the church since Vatican II, and all these bad things, and we've got this, that, and the other thing happening, and Father Martin and others like that. And here's the issue. First of all, that's a false dichotomy. Okay, first of all, Tim Gordon, who is criticizing society, okay, that's sort of him and Dave, do criticize the official church for not being more stand-up, for not protecting the church from liturgical abuses and from heretics. So it's not like they're not, and we're not agreeing with him on those points, that those other people are also doing bad things. So you can't just say that, well, because they're doing those bad things, that's worse, therefore you can't criticize the society, or shouldn't. I don't agree with that. I think that's a false dichotomy. And I do agree with him that I think it puts the hierarchy in a really tough position to criticize more traditional people when they're refusing to criticize people who are obviously in heretical. Let's just call it what it is. I think that is a problem, and I agree with Steve on that, and I agree with a lot of people on that. I often wonder, do you really think that Saint Ignatius of Antioch, Saint Cyprian, both Saint Cyril's, Jerusalem and Alexandria, Saint Basil the Great, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Augustine, Saint Irenaeus, you think any of these people, any of these bishops of the church would have wondered, Pope St. Leo the Great, would they have even taken 2 minutes to wonder and, well, I don't know if we should deny communion to pro-abortion Catholic politicians or not. It's, no, that's obvious. And it is a scandal that people like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi have rarely been denied communion, that they should have been censured a long time ago. And the fact that the hierarchy does fail to censure people of that ilk does make it harder for traditional people to accept criticisms and censures of traditionalists. And I understand that. And so I'm with him on that. It shouldn't just be censuring traditionalists who go astray, but should also apply to the more liberal or heterodox factions. There are tons of liturgical abuses that just go unchecked, and it's awful, it's terrible, and it's misleading, and it's not okay. But I don't think that's a reason not to fraternally correct Society of St. Pius X supporters in the society itself. And here's why. I think that, for one, if we want to try to fight for the church from within, which is, right, that's what we're called to do. That's why we say the Protestant Reformation was wrong. It's why the great schism between East and West was bad. You must maintain visible unity. That's a hallmark of Catholic theology. It's like the first principle of you do not break union with Rome. You do not disobey the Pope. The solemn definitions of Vatican I, the church teaching and law that he is the supreme pontiff who has direct, immediate, full juridical power over the whole church and every individual member. You have to obey him. He has that authority. So you can't prop up the authority of the papacy, the Catholic understanding of the papacy, and then refuse to live it. You can't say, well, they're supporting Orthodox teaching, but maybe in their words theoretically, but then they're not, because they're denying his authority and they're disobeying him. And they're appealing to their own interpretation of it being an emergency situation. But guess what? The law itself says that the Supreme Pontiff, as the Supreme Legislature, is the one who is also the interpreter of the law, the authentic interpreter of the law. So if the Holy Father says that it's not a state of emergency, then it's not. It doesn't justify you. You can't determine that on your own. So let's go a little bit through the history of the society. And I'm not, an expert on the history of the society, but I know something of it, and I just want to cover the highlights, and so we can talk about my issues with it. Okay. Basically, the society was started in 1970. There were some seminarians that were kind of having trouble. I guess they were in a liberal seminary, and they were getting some flack about pre-Vatican II teachings that they were upholding. I don't know what they were. I don't know the details. That would be interesting to know, actually. And so they kind of approached him, and he ended up discerning with them that they were going to start a society, and they got permission from a bishop to do so. And they were granted this Pia Unio status, which is like a pious union. And it's sort of like the first stage on canonical regulation. It was for 6 years as an experimental basis to have this society. And for various reasons, it didn't last. In 1975, so 5 years later, the status was removed after cardinals overseeing it granted the bishop who had granted it permission to revoke it. And so they lost that status. And then in 1976, Archbishop Lefebvre was going to ordain priests of the society, and he was told by Rome he could not do it. They forbade it, and he went ahead with those as well. So this idea that you can't judge Lefebvre just based on one act. Well, this wasn't once 1988 thing, which that will come to. It happened before. So this was a continuous, years-long propensity for disobedience. So he did it anyway, and he was notified that he was suspended automatically, and so were the priests who received orders from him. So for at least a period of 1 year, they were suspended. They were not allowed to perform any sacraments whatsoever. Priestly faculties were not allowed to be used licitly, and in some cases validly, depending on the sacrament. And Lefebvre himself had even recognized that, this kind of is an irregular status. That's not good. But it is what it is. And he just sort of kept going. And despite the fact that they were no longer recognized, the society kept doing its own thing. And then it kind of came to a head. There were some dialogues going back and forth. Apparently there was some promise that he would be brought back in, and he'd be allowed to ordain some bishops to continue the traditionalist bent within the church or trajectory, but then he never got it. So he was worried that he was going to die before he could ordain new bishops, and basically requested permission, I guess on multiple occasions, in succession to be able to do it. And Pope John Paul II kept saying no. So, Lefebvre knew that he needed permission to do it, and yet at one point he was like, that's it, if you're not going to give me permission, I'm going to do it anyway. He was told not to. He was warned. He did it anyway. That incurs a latae sententiae, that's in the act itself, excommunication. And, he was even warned by Pope John Paul II that it would be considered a schismatic act. And then, so after it happened anyway, that latae sententiae excommunication was then also declared, so made public, that yes, they have incurred, him and those 4 bishops, as well as the one helping, I think, were under the censure of excommunication. So this also creates a problem. It's some legal issues. One, it means they have no jurisdiction. So there's priestly powers and even episcopal powers, but some of them also, so it's not just, for instance, any validly ordained priest can celebrate Mass and it'd be considered valid, but it's not necessarily licit to do that. So there's an illicit, meaning against the law. So it might be valid, consecration might take place, but it's not licit to celebrate. But then there's other sacraments that require, not for their validity, some sort of juridical power, some sort of jurisdiction. Some people might not know this, but even now, technically the reason that a priest of one diocese can hear another diocese is that the law itself says now that if you have faculties from your diocese, then that priest who has faculties from his own diocese can then hear confessions anywhere unless it's been revoked in a given place by a bishop. But the reality of it is you do have to have faculties to hear confessions. Just because you're ordained a priest does not mean you can always validly hear confessions. Without faculties, without the jurisdiction, you cannot, except in states, in people in danger of death, immediate danger of death. Then the law grants that. So there's still, but that's because it's still juridical. The law is granting it in those instances and specifies that. Wasn't the case with the society. Also marriages. There was actually a case I heard of where a cardinal from Spain presided over a wedding that he didn't have that was later considered to be invalid because he hadn't gotten, I think, the approval of the pastor of the parish, which is actually required because it wasn't his diocese. So he didn't have jurisdiction in that diocese, and you need to have the permission or delegation from the pastor. So it was actually found out that it was invalidly done. So same with society, that they didn't have valid confessions or valid marriages. So that's been a longstanding bone of contention with me. Is one reason I do not like them, is that they're proclaiming to be traditional, proclaiming to be Catholic, while ignoring the directives of the Supreme Legislature and of the Church, the Pope, and they were hearing invalid confessions. They were telling people that they were absolving them from their sins, and they had no authority to do so, and they were invalid. Yes, do I know that they try to create some sort of hermeneutical gymnastics to overcome that, and that Lefebvre appealed to the 1917 code? Well, guess what? He appealed to it after 1983, when the 1970 code wasn't even in effect. So legally speaking, there's no standing there. But, obviously, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments trying to defend them and do this gymnastics. The reality of it is, look, visible unity within the church has always been a hallmark of the Catholic Church. They are not in full communion with the church. It's only been recently that Pope Francis, they've been granted more and more recognition. Pope Francis, for the Year of Mercy, granted faculties for hearing confessions, basically declaring their confessions to have valid absolution. And people say, oh, well, look, then he must be recognized that they have jurisdiction. And so, blah, 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 blah. Well, okay, but if they already had faculties before that, so from 1988 or even 76 up until 2015, they've been doing it without that. If they already had it, then he wouldn't have had to give it to them. So you can't retroactively then say they've been hearing valid confessions. And you also can't just say, oh, well, see, he recognizes them as legitimate. No, he's doing that for the sake of the souls during the Year of Mercy, and then he extended it in 2016. He did it for the sake of those souls, so that they wouldn't be getting invalid confessions unbeknownst to themselves. It's not a formal recognition of some canonical regular status of the society. It's just not. They're at minimum in canonically irregular status and maximum still in schism, because they are, according to the Code of Canon Law, schism is defined by refusal to separate oneself from, I forget the exact terminology. Basically, it's a refusal or removal of submission to the Roman pontiff. So when you're not submitting to his authority, or it says, a refusal to be in communion with those who are under the popes or who are subjected to the pope, that's a state of schism. Well, they're not in communion with the dioceses around the world. They're not in communion with, they're not obeying and subjecting themselves to the Roman pontiff. They're remaining in disobedience. And despite a lot of reaching out of Ratzinger, then Pope Benedict XVI, in his attempts to try to reconcile, and they kept refusing, and then they said they would, and then they wouldn't, and all this back and forth, they've still refused. And I think as good, faithful Catholics, we have to be concerned with the salvation of their souls, and that's why I think it matters. I don't think the argument there's bigger fish to fry is true. One, because we should be concerned about those who with us consider ourselves orthodox and or traditional, that we want to protect ourselves as close as we are in theology, or on the need for orthodoxy and love of tradition, that we should be concerned for our salvation of those who are close to us in that regard. And when we see a grave delict, we can't just ignore it, and we can't say that, as Steve Skojac did. And he basically said that, look, and he admitted it, he's got problems with them. He does not attend their stuff. He's got issues with it. He cannot himself even join them in that sense, because he does have those issues with them. And says, but basically, why don't we just leave them alone? There's worse people out there. And I don't like that. And it somewhat vaguely reminds me, I want to push it too strongly, but it vaguely reminds me of those who say, well, I'm personally against abortion, but it's up to individuals' decisions. If you're calling out, which he obviously already sees himself, for instance, he sees that they're in a grave situation, and there's fundamental problems with them. I mean, he's admitting it, but he's not really pushing it. He's basically saying, but I don't want to criticize them anyway. But that's just sort of ignoring the problem. And it's perpetuating the problem. Think about how much stronger we could be as a group within the church if we brought them back into full communion, or if they, agreed to submit to the Roman pontiff and accept the offer of a personal prelature, which I think they were offered and then declined. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm not a perfect historian on all these things. I understand that. But how much stronger we could be if we worked together. If all of the members of the society were in the Fraternity of St. Peter or similar things, or were diocesan doing extraordinary form liturgies, making that more widely available, I mean, that'd be so much better. It would grant people who want to stay within the community of the church, like the Gordons. Tim Gordon would love to go to the traditional Mass within full ecclesial communion, and yet it's really hard for him. Well, imagine if we did have more people, if the society people came over. That's why I care. It's hurting the traditionalism, or the traditional, it's hurting orthodoxy and traditional practices within the full community of the church by having them stay outside. So this idea that, we're being divisive by criticizing them, no, the division's already there. We're calling it out and we want to heal it. We want to bring them back. Sort of like the Catholic Orthodox dialogue, which is one of my big areas of study and publication and concern. I want to bring back the unity, and I'm not going to refuse to call them out because they're overall nice, or they're close to us. I think we need that unity back within the fullness of the Catholic Church under the Supreme Pontiff. And I do think it's problematic when, for decades you offer invalid confessions and, but pretend to be the true Catholics. It's not good, I think the reason it bothers me is the same reason it bothered Steve, that he doesn't like people criticizing because obviously they care about orthodoxy and traditional practice. That's why I actually feel like they need to be called out. The corruption of the greatest is the worst. And Satan loves to use that. He loves to take what's most sacred and what's most beautiful and most true and twist it. Get that 99% truth in there and then throw in an error if you can, if it's going to make people fall, Get them rallied up, prideful about the fact that they are Orthodox, and then blind them to their own heterodox ways. It's interesting to see how, Ratzinger once said that at bottom, a lot of traditionalists and liberals are the same. They pick one area of the church and they say that's it. Or, they both end up doing making some of the same arguments, which is appeal to personal conscience, and talking about good intentions, all over objectivity. Well, that's sort of like the liberal argument being used by the society. Well, he meant well, look at the whole of his life. He had good reasons or good intentions for doing it, even if objectively it was against disobedience. And, his personal conscience would say this. Well, it sounds like a very liberal argument to me. And you see this all the time. And it's what the reformers used as well. Somehow they were justified in their disobedience and their separation. And I don't like it because I worry about the salvation of their souls, and I worry about the salvation of souls of people who don't know any better being drawn into it. I'd rather have them being fishers of men within the Catholic fold. We could use that, and that's why I find it to be important. And again, I don't think I know everything. I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of hard feelings here and difficulties. But I am saying we we need to at least accept that there is a canonical structure, there is a juridical structure of the church. It is a visible unity, and we cannot break it. And yes, I do think at the same time we need to start calling out and calling for bishops and Rome to be more forthright in condemning heresies and addressing liturgical abuses and other, bad practices. I do think we need to do that. So I just wish we could do that together. And I don't think us criticizing the society was leading to that division. It's their existence outside the church makes our existence within the church more difficult, because then other people within the church that are more liberal say, oh, you're just like those folks. So that doesn't really help our cause. And it gives a bad reputation to the extraordinary form. So I think that's important. I really do. And maybe in later episodes we'll talk more about like Dignitatis Humanae, who, which has been pointed out to me is probably one of the biggest areas of disagreement. And I've also seen statements where they don't actually have a doctrinal problem with Vatican II per se, or if they do, it's on just a very small few points. Well, okay, if that's true, then how come that's all they ever talk about? There's only a couple of minor points in Vatican II that really they think justifies not obeying, which, by the way, Lefebvre signed all the documents. So he was at Vatican II and signed them all. Now, maybe he didn't want to, but he did. If it is true that it's only some of those, then why is it that a lot of people in the traditionalist movement who talk about Vatican II basically just say throw it out, like Taylor Marshall says? It's all bad. And that's another thing, when Steve had mentioned that nothing Orthodox has really come out since 1965, or at least nothing as Orthodox as what the Society teaches, that just strikes me as really bad. I mean, you have multiple saints, and by the way, canonization is considered part of papal infallibility, so Pope St. John Paul II is actually a saint, and so is John the 23rd, and so is Pope Paul VI. And you look at the teachings on Veritatis Splendor and the CDF document Dominus Jesus, Communionis Notio. And I argued Humani Vitae, and I got flack for that, as somehow that wasn't traditionalist enough. Can you really say that nothing good has come? And I think that's the other point, is I think a lot of the society people and those who follow them, and even some traditionalists who are within the Catholic Church fold, have sort of gotten this blinders on that nothing good, if you can't say anything good about anything from the magisterium after Vatican II, or starting with Vatican II. It's a very bad way of looking at things, and it doesn't help the cause. Because it also means you're missing a lot of great things that are in there. The churches did not die in 1962 with this opening of the Second Vatican Council. There are great things that have come out. We should be talking about those and teaching them and relishing in them, and not only complaining about bad things, even though there are a lot. So I think that's another reason, because I think they're missing out on a lot of good things, because they're not even, it doesn't seem like they're willing to look at any of it. They're just, the whole thing's just sad, and it really does break my heart. And I think we do have to boldly call them out, call them to repentance, and bring them back in union. And I think, as many have pointed out, that there does need to be a dialogue about their issues. But from what I understand, they did have those, and they weren't able to resolve them even then. But I would like to see point-counterpoint discussions on their questions. I think that would be healthy. But we have to obey. We have to be in the union of the church. That's the hallmark of Catholicism. You can't throw that out and then claim that you're the true Catholics. That's my biggest issue. And I apologize that I'm rambling a little bit, but that's where I'm at. I think Dave's right. I think we do need to address this, and it's going to hurt. It's painful to address family squabbles, if you will, but it needs to be done because there is real danger there. And yeah, there's danger elsewhere too, but that doesn't. You can't say, "Oh, but look at that danger," to ignore this one. That's not a good argument. So I think this needs to happen, and I think we do need to stand up against this. And when I say against the society, I really mean for them becoming canonically regular. Sometimes in the spiritual battle, you have to understand that spiritual warfare is the one warfare, the only warfare that's fought for the sake of your human enemies. You're trying to battle against them for them. And that's how I think we should see it. God bless.